microorganisms, and it's shown a lot of reductions in terms of some of your more pathogenic organisms. So there's a lot of promising elements, but I do think a lot more needs to go into it before you can fully say from a food safety standpoint that it can go onto the market just because it's a new food source.
Yeah, thank you, Leah. Absolutely fascinating and great set of questions. So we'll
Cool,
move over
you,
to
guys.
Vusi now. Thank you. So Vusi is a lecturer at the Department of Food Science and Technology at CPUT. He has a MSc degree from Wageningen University in the Netherlands and an MTech degree from CPUT. He's currently completing his PhD at CPUT, and he is a member of the SAAFoST Cape branch, student mentor, and a reviewer of several journals. And Vusi will talk to us a bit more about the technofunctional properties of edible insect proteins. While we obviously would, from an environmental and economic point of view, as well as food security, we'd like to incorporate them into our diets. We need to understand this better to be able to actually use them in food formulations. So Vusi, we look forward to your talk.
Okay, thank you very much, Lisa, for that wonderful introduction and brilliant presentation by Leah. Some of the stuff kind of overlaps what I've already prepared, and you're throwing the burden on me, but it's fine, we'll do that. Yeah, as the title has been recited, I just want to say that at CPUT, over the past few years, we have been working on black soldier fly larvae for product development, but more recently we started looking at the scientific basis for incorporating edible insects, and we also ventured into looking at Mopane worm recently. We are under the leadership of Prof. Van Wyk as a project leader for the insect project, and as part of my PhD thesis, I also looked at black soldier fly in particular. So the content of my presentation would basically look at the protein challenge, and we'll look at the edible insects in Africa. We'll talk about the case for edible insects and delve deeper into technofunctional properties, and I'll make some concluding remarks. So it is widely accepted that by the year 2050, the world population is expected to reach approximately 9 billion people here on Earth, and that poses a lot of challenges in terms of food production, because now we have to produce twice the amount of food that we are currently producing. And at the same time, the food consumption per capita is expected also to increase, more specifically in developing countries. And this also poses a lot of challenges because the amount of available arable land is also shrinking, and you also have challenges in terms of sustainability. We see what global warming and climate change is doing to food production systems. But particularly in Africa, we have a problem in terms of food security. It remains a major challenge. And some estimates that there's around 2 billion people in the planet who are suffering from protein malnutrition. So therefore, there is a case to be made for edible insect consumptions. So, but now speaking of proteins, what do we understand about these proteins? So we can group proteins into three sources, and then their roles, they can also be categorized into three roles. So if we look at the sources, we know of animal proteins, we are familiar with red and white meat, farmed and wild caught fish, and then we can also have then that category insects. But also there is a huge movement that is also revolutionizing the food industry as far as the plant proteins, which looks particularly at pulses, legumes, and grains. However, one of the disadvantages of plant proteins is that sometimes they carry what we call anti-nutritional factors, and some of these plant proteins, they do not have the full complement of the essential amino acids or the amino acids. But 20 years ago, it would have been impossible to imagine that today we would be talking about a lab-grown meat. So these are also other alternatives that are coming out in the market, so people becoming innovative. So if we look at the role of proteins, we are looking basically at three things: the nutritional, the physiological, the physical, or the technological. So I'm going to be focusing mostly on the technological part. So the technological part is what is answering some of the questions that have been asked here in terms of texture. What does the proteins do when they are incorporated into the food products? So think about the texture of bread, think about the foam that happens in beer. And this is influenced by the three-dimensional form of the protein, and the other two, which is the nutritional and physiological, they are affected mainly by the primary structure of these proteins. So just to have a look in terms of edible insects, we know that the practice of consuming insects, especially in Africa, is not really a new idea. Insects have been consumed in Africa for decades, if not centuries. And so what we see here is that these insects, in some cases, they've been consumed as delicacies. But over the past few years, we've seen an increase in terms of the research that has gone to in trying to understand these edible insects in terms of their nutritional properties, how we can improve for food security. As Leah has also mentioned that in last year, we also had a lot of media coverage in terms of the concept store, which I think they did a very fantastic job there. But also, if you're on social media recently, you would have noted that the Minister of Finance, Mr. Tito Mboweni, has been doing some cooking. And in one of the sessions, he also cooked his meal with mopani worms, and also that generated a lot of interest. So some people, they are really familiar with this practice of consuming edible insects, and it is not something that is strange. And also here in our backyard in South Africa, there is also a movement that is moving towards that direction. So what do we understand about these insects? We know that literature tells us that there's almost 2,100 edible insect species. But if we look at the global picture in terms of edible insects, we've got 1 million insects that are available, and 0.5% of those are the ones that we can categorize as harmful. In terms of these edible insects, beetles are high up there, with more of them falling in that range, but also you've got caterpillars, and you also have termites there, which includes things like mopani worms, and then the flies will include things like black soldier fly. So is there a case to be made for edible insect consumption in South Africa? And if we look at the nutritional composition, we see that in terms of the proteins and in some cases the fat, if we consider, for example, crickets or mealworms, these have protein contents which are comparable to these traditional sources of proteins that we are accustomed to. And in some cases, they have fiber because of the chitin that is found there. But in terms of farming, because I also mentioned something about available land, so we see that insects can also be farmed and they can also be reared. We see these days there are concepts like vertical farming. So if you take a look at agri-protein, the operation is most like a food industry, a food processing plant, whereby the strict quality control, the strict hygiene that goes in there, and then the return in terms of the harvesting far exceeds those of plant proteins, plant sources like your rapeseed or even your soybean. So there is a case to be made in terms of the production of these insects, as long as they are able, as Leah mentioned, to convert this organic mass or this organic material into their own mass, and then we can then be able to then derive components such as proteins, fat, and even in some cases essential fatty acids. So a lot of people, the reason why there is this aversion perhaps towards consuming insects is that we are accustomed to insects being things that are produced in an uncontrolled environment. And for example, if you see the pictures above there, so everything is open to air, and then some people may think that there are safety issues. But now we need to imagine or reimagine the whole system from moving from an agno-entomophagy to entomophagy to rearing or farming of these insects. And we see that in some countries like Thailand, even here in South Africa, there are already people who have started farming black soldier fly for feed and for food consumption. So there is a paradigm shift in terms of these processes that are happening. But what I want to draw your attention to is in terms of what could be extracted from these insects. Lipids could be something that is extracted, as Leah has mentioned. We did work on some fatty acid composition of black soldier fly, trying to extract these oils. And then now we are currently looking at the proteins, and we can also look at chitin. So if you look at protein, let me take you back to your biochemistry class for those who did biochemistry. So we know that proteins basically are macromolecules in line with carbohydrates, lipids, and fats. But the building blocks of proteins are amino acids, and these amino acids determines what happens at the secondary structure, tertiary structure, and the quaternary structure. So the sequence of these amino acids, either in the insects or in other species in general, plays an important role in terms of ensuring what do you get as in terms of essential amino acids. So essential amino acids are those that our bodies require because we cannot synthesize them, and then they must be supplied by the diet. So if your diet is lacking in terms of essential amino acids, you may have protein deficiencies, etc. So we see that these proteins, these amino acids play a role also in terms of determining the structure that you're going to have in terms of your final protein. So any journey of trying to understand protein, especially in the insects, what we are currently at this dispensation, will begin with identifying these sources. So what are these sources that we want to process? Discovery and selection of these sources. For example, looking at what we have in South Africa, is it a good idea to go for Mopani worm as an insect source, or is a protein source, or should we look at black soldier fly, mealworms, and stuff like that? But then for us to go to the food industry, Leah mentioned a very vital point, which I think needs to be emphasized, is that some people in the context of South Africa prefer that these insects are incorporated in food products in an unrecognizable form. So she used the word disguised. So basically you would use them as ingredients, as powders, because currently there's three forms in which these insects are consumed. It can either be whole, it can either be paste, or it can either be as part of ingredients. So you would need to have a system where you process them. So if you're talking about proteins, proteins would need to have something like isolation. What are the techniques that we are using to isolate these proteins, and how do you extract them? What forms of drying are you using? And then once you have these proteins, they then have to be characterized, looking at the size in terms of molecular weights, looking at the chemical composition, and then you can then tailor-make the structures. So the characterization then informs the functionality or the technofunctionality. Perhaps now we are asking yourself, I've been hearing you talking about technofunctionality. What is this technofunctionality that you're talking about? So technofunctionality of an ingredient can be defined as any property of the food, in this case of the protein, except its nutritional value that will affect its utilization. So if you want to utilize this protein, what are these factors that will affect its utilization? And so we talk about things like solubility, forming properties, emulsification, gelling, and bioactivity. So I'm going to delve deep into this. But before I get there, so the technofunctionality of these edible insect proteins needs to be established. We need to understand what is the solubility properties of these edible insects because these are the things that are going to inform your product preparation or your product design or your formulation. And also remember that when we talk about foods, food is a complex mixture of chemicals. You know, there are other things that are present there. How do these proteins interact? How do they behave when they are used under acidic conditions, right? So we need to take that into consideration. But the functionality determines how are you going to use your proteins. And then the benefits is that we would have products which maybe they are high in nutritional value, and in some cases they can taste better and they have good texture, and then we can then be able to make certain claims. So if I look at the first factor, which is solubility, when we talk of protein technofunctionality or functionality used interchangeably, solubility is very key. So the solubility of proteins depends on the nature of the protein surfaces when they come in contact with the environment. In most cases, we are looking at water. So if I generalize, I can say the protein which has got more hydrophilic surface will be more soluble in water than a protein which is more hydrophobic surface. So this solubility is very important, very key, because it influences other functional properties such as forming and emulsification properties. So if we look at a study that was conducted by Professor Schutler in Germany in 2016 using mealworm as an example. So you start up with a full fat mealworm powder, and then you remove the fat, so through a defatting phase. And then once you've removed the fat, you can then start to extract the protein. So what we see in terms of solubility as a function of pH, we see that at a lower pH, the proteins, which is the black bars, they have a high solubility at pH 2 compared to the samples or to the samples with the full fat. So the pH, as it increases, the solubility then begins to drop. So the solubility is at max minimum at a pH around 4. And we know that now we have established that the isoelectric point, which is the point of the proteins where the net charge is 0, is around 4.5. So at the isoelectric point, you have the ability, the protein has the ability to form what we call aggregates. As the pH increases, the solubility starts to increase again. So what is the mechanism that is involved here? The fact is that the protein, they carry a charge at any given pH except the isoelectric point. So what happens is that this charge at higher pH or at the extremes results in what we call electrostatic repulsion. So this electrostatic repulsion is what contributes to the stability of your proteins in solution. For example, where you can use proteins as stabilizers in foams or proteins as stabilizers in beverages. So what you want to do here is that if you've got a product that is an acidic medium, right, for example, a beverage, so it should be better be soluble at a lower pH. And what we see in terms of insects is that other insects such as caterpillars, if they studied full fat versus defatted flowers, these ones, they exhibited very poor solubility. And a study that was also conducted looked at the enzymatic hydrolysis. You remember previously I mentioned the processing. So enzymatic hydrolysis basically breaks down these protein components. And we see that this technique improved the solubility of locust by around 55%. So solubility is the first key, very important factor that needs to be considered before we even go further. The second factor is water binding capacity. So this speaks to the hydration or rehydration, which is again another first important step in imparting desirable functional properties in food systems. Here we see that samples of, in the case of black soldier fly, which is H. lucens, and timolite, which is a mealworm, we see that fractions that had a high protein content suddenly had a high fat absorption capacity, right? So meaning as you remove the fat from these samples, then you bestow upon it high water binding capacity. So this water binding capacity then determines the texture and the stability of dry goods, and in some cases extruded products. So other techniques that can be used to treat edible insects includes what we call cold atmospheric plasma processing. This has also been shown to increase the oil binding capacity. Now, so remember I said that food systems are very complex, and food molecules interact with other things that are present there. So you would want to see how does this protein behave if I have a sample product that is high in oil properties, and how does it behave when it is in a solution that is water, is able to bind water. So here, in terms of the protein, we need to consider the intrinsic factors, such as, for example, the amino acid composition is very important, and the protein conformation, and then also looking at the surface polarity or hydrophobic nature of these proteins. So there is some work that has been done, but not all edible insect species have been established. You know, it's what we already have at our disposal, and we are also looking at some work at CPUT. So some of the work that we have done last year, which is yet to be published, but we've presented it at a conference, we looked at the forming capacity and the forming stability of black soldier fly and Mopani worms. So forms, we know that these are dispersion of gases in a liquid form, right? So in liquids. So because of these proteins, because of their what we call their amphiphilic nature, so the proteins are able to reside in the interfacial area between the air and your gas bubbles. So then they can be able to stabilize these forms. So by forming capacity is the ability of this protein to give you a form. And then by forming stability, we mean how long does it take for that particular form to remain stable. So we really saw some interesting things that when we look at the forming capacity of a, for example, the black soldier fly versus the Mopani. The Mopani, if you increase the concentration of the protein, it will give you a high form capacity, and then if you look at the stability was low compared to the black soldier fly. So why is this happening? So what happens is that because of the molecular weight or because of the molecular structure, forms collapse, you know, the gas bubbles. So it's a concept which is called disproportionation. So the stability then of these forms depends largely on the protein permeability. But what inference we can make is that, for example, in terms of stability, as you can see in that picture on the far right, you see that black soldier fly is very high compared to Mopani worm, and we can infer that this can be used as an alternative to egg, which is currently a forming agent. But other studies have also seen that in some insects, the foam capacity was around 6%. And in a study that was conducted in Wageningen in 2013, where they looked at house cricket did not exhibit any forming properties. So the last one that I want to talk about is the emulsion capacity and stability. So this is now the ability of these proteins to stabilize or to form emulsions. So what do you need in an emulsion? So an ideal quality of an emulsifier for oil in water emulsions is that it should have a balanced amino acid composition, and it should have either charged polar and apolar side chains. So this is where we talk about the amphipathic nature of these proteins. With the exception of grasshoppers, we see that the edible insects on the far left of this red line, they are also comparable in terms of these emulsion capacity and stability compared to the counterparts, which are plant proteins, right? Things like lupin is very high in the emulsion stability. So we still need to do a lot of work in terms of understanding these proteins in terms of how do they behave in terms of these technofunctional properties. So if I can give you some of the example of what is already in literature, some people have studied, mostly mealworm is one of the, close to black soldier fly. Between those two are the most studied insects. So we see that some people have used mealworms or silkworms in crickets in sausages. And I think also Leah worked with sausages previously. And we also see that some crickets can also have been used in giving cricket bars, and termites have also been used in buns and pastas. And some people have already went ahead and baked bread using insect flowers, having pastas, and I've seen some pictures online in terms of the mopane salt. I'm yet to grab to have my hands on it, but it's something that is already there in the South African markets. And the popcorns, which are kind of having some extracts of mopane, they are also there. So there is a plenty in terms of what can be done with edible insects, but we still need to establish more research, because in terms of these technofunctional properties, because it's what is going to inform your application. Where are you going to apply, and what kind of behavior or properties are you trying to achieve? So in conclusion, we know, or we have established from literature, that these edible insect species, they are high in protein content, and this can also contribute to food security. In terms of technofunctional properties, we see in some cases it's comparable to plant proteins. However, we need to treat it at a case-by-case basis, studying more edible insects and looking at the technofunctionality. And here we also see that there are opportunities for new product developments, for products to be developed, and for new markets to be opened. And to reiterate what Leah has said, she also raised vital points that the consumer perceptions, especially in the South African context or even African context, needs to be further be established. And I think we need to be driven by empirical data, you know, rather than maybe in some cases relying on emotions, because now once we have data, we can then make inferences. And in terms of legislation in South Africa, I'm not yet aware of any legislation that governs the safety or the production of or incorporation of edible insects in food production for human consumption. And I think that still needs to be kind of established. Otherwise, I see a point where innovation is going to be the one that drives legislation in South Africa if regulators are slow to regulate or to come up with ways there. And just in conclusion, I think for me, for future consideration, we also need to consider more industry collaboration with academia, and also looking at small farmers in terms of how they produce these edible insects, and before they are incorporated into food systems, looking at quality in terms of the, because again, these edible insect proteins, they are influenced, as Leah has said, by what you feed these insects. So we still need to establish more routine, more analysis, and then the collaboration between these three arms. For me, I think it's what is very important going forward in the South African context. Thank you very much.
Super, thank you, Vusi, for a fascinating talk, and really interesting to see the work that you have been doing at CPUT on this. We've got a question here around food security, and will this really benefit populations that are suffering from protein malnutrition, or will it be too expensive?
I think with every innovation there comes the cost, but as Leah has said, in some cases, for now, in the initial stages of innovations, things become really expensive. And I think given with time, and if there could be large scale production, I do think that there's a possibility that this can alleviate food security.
Thank you. Vusi, from my side, where will you take your PhD work next in terms of this space?
Currently now my work, because we've established some scientific basis, we envision a situation whereby we want to go to more product development phase, and I do think that it's not necessarily a case where we can use one, let's say, insect, but maybe kind of try combinations at first. You know, I worked in a project where we were looking at the plant proteins or pulses, so where we used combinations of either lupin, faba bean, chickpea to kind of develop these structures that will be desirable. So with my work, I think now we need to go towards application. So we've established some scientific basis, but now I think the application for us, it's what is going to be very crucial.
And Vusi, if you consider what you've learned, especially around the emulsification comparability to plant-based proteins, in your mind, where's the easiest commercial opportunity for insect protein?
Yeah, for insect protein, I think there's a lot of stuff that can also be done. So maybe looking at beverages, and also in some cases, you can also look at bakery products. So you can also start there. I'm not sure about other markets, but I think those two can something that we can start looking at.
Great. And if you mentioned legislation, what has happened around the world, and what do you think? You know, what could that legislation look like for South Africa?
So in Europe, the experiences that I've had there, so they talk about the EFSA, the European Food Safety Association. So they are really also working hard in terms of coming up with legislation. Like in the Netherlands, as Leah has said, that the larvae or the insects, they need to be fed on a clean feed. So in South Africa, I think we can also learn some things from there. But I also think that we as South African also have to come up with solutions that are going to be beneficial for our context. But at the moment, I would really love to have a situation whereby us as industry, the food industry, the academia, and also government kind of have a conversation, because from when I started since I think 2016-17, there hasn't been really any movement or any conversation that has happened with regards to legislation. And I think we also stand a chance to learn from other people what they have done. EFSA is really putting a lot of regulation with regards to edible insects for human consumption.
Thank you. We have a few more questions. The allergenicity of black soldier fly larvae, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I did anticipate this question. We have not yet studied it, but I think it's something that also needs to be explored in the future. So to look at the allergenicity of black soldier fly, I don't have really any data that I can report on with regards to that, but I think it's something that is worth exploring.
And this question around pet food products using insects, has that any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's quite really challenging because now, for example, some people can perceive that as kind of with a negative. And I think Leah mentioned the point where we need to also look at the branding or the marketing. How do we market these edible insect proteins? So that will also be a very important factor. Already, yes, there is a market that is there for insects as a feed. So whereby people are feeding it to pests. I came across a very interesting study which suggested that chickens that have been fed with black soldier fly had very good egg color, shape, and then in some cases the egg yolk was double on those chickens that were fed black soldier fly. So in some cases you may find that already insects are already in the system for human consumption in one way or another, but it's something I think that also needs to be kind of looked at in further studies.
Thank you. And Vusi, have you seen research or evaluated the farming process and practice of farming of insects from a sustainability point of view?
Professor Alexander Matthijs in ETH Zurich in Switzerland. I had the pleasure of meeting him. So he has done a lot of work in terms of life cycle assessment, but it's very complex calculations and situations. But what they are reporting, that there is some sustainability that can be sustainability benefits that can be derived from edible insects. And again, with my little knowledge of sustainability, you also have to take into consideration the whole value chain, looking at energy in and then XAG out. In the South African context, I think we are still lacking behind. And perhaps one of my appeals is that as academics and industry, as we begin to engage, I think we also need to move away from, when we think about edible insects now, the only thing that people are doing, they're going to tell you high protein, low fat, or minerals and what. But we have not yet really delved deeper in terms of the value process as a whole, looking at the sustainability, because what goes into your process and then what comes out there, also those are things that needs to be factored in to come up with claims that your process is sustainably developed.
Yes. And one final one around, once it gets to a commercial scale, how does one manage the raw material specification in terms of meeting a specific protein and fat target?
So one of the parts of my PhD was to look at the structural properties of these proteins, particularly black soldier fly, using a technique which is called FTIR, Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy. So what spectroscopy does, it tells you in terms of the molecular vibrations of your edible insect protein. So basically, we are looking at what are these bands that really emits high IR, and then what are they? So mostly we see that with proteins, you've got what we call the amide 1 and then the amide 2 bands. And then you also have the fingerprint region. So in terms of developing specifications, I think that is one of the tools that can then be used to develop specifications, and it's going to assist us to solve the problem of, for example, authenticity, for example, where people can then put in other things and then claim that these are insect proteins. So the work that I've done has demonstrated that we can use that tool in order to identify. So we use what we call soft independent modeling class analogy to basically show that if you've got edible insect proteins, you can put in adulterants. For example, you can mix them with maize, you can mix them with soy. Spectroscopy or FTIR is going to show you basically in terms of authenticity. So I think that is a technique that can also be used to create then the specifications when this goes into an industrial scale.
Super, thank you, Vusi. We've got a comment here from Corinne Davies from FACTS on the allergenicity question. She says that FACTS is also doing some work on it. It's not yet clear, but there does seem to be some cross-reactivity with crustaceans. Thank you, Corinne. So there's no more questions. And I just want to thank both our speakers for absolutely fascinating talks and taking us on this journey of edible insects, which I'm sure will be part of our diets in the not too distant future, if not already. And really, really proud to see all the work that's happening in our own country on this with CPUT, with Stellenbosch, and really encourage the two of you to keep going at that. And it would be really wonderful if we could take the academia, government, and industry and find a way to collaborate and actually really solve food security issues, as well as bringing real innovation and novelty to our food markets. So thank you to you both, and thank you to everyone who attended.
Okay, thank you very much.